Okay, let's dive right into this explainer and unpack the truly fascinating cognitive science behind how our brains actually process and acquire a new language. Today we're going to take a really structured look at the actual neurological and cognitive mechanics that drive language learning. We're clearing away all those marketing myths you hear from language apps, and we're looking strictly at the data to understand what's really happening inside your head. I mean, we've all been there, right? You download some shiny new app, maybe you fall asleep listening to a French radio station, just hoping that somehow, by sheer exposure, the language will just kind of wash over you and miraculously stick. We've all tried it, and, well, we've all failed. It is an incredibly common struggle. So our mission today is to totally bust the myth that you can reach fluency simply by passively listening, because as we'll see from the cognitive science, adult brains just aren't wired to absorb a second language through osmosis. So here is our structural blueprint for exactly how we're going to break this down today. We'll start with the language learning puzzle, then move to counting words unconsciously. After that, we'll look at the limits of listening, figure out how to build the conscious bridge, and finally, tie it all together as a complex adaptive system. All right, part one, the language learning puzzle, demystifying the brain's mechanics. For decades, researchers have been trying to figure out the exact mechanics of how a second language is acquired. It's honestly one of the greatest mysteries in cognitive science. Think about it. Why is it that toddlers, who literally can't even tie their own shoes yet, seem to just effortlessly pick up their native tongue, but adults, who have fully developed, highly capable brains, struggle so profoundly to learn a new one? And you know what's literally mind-blowing about this? This core insight is over a century old. Back in 1916, the linguist Ferdinand de Saussure posited that our brains hold this massive storehouse of language. And that idea perfectly anchors the cognitive science of today. The modern research we're looking at confirms that everything you say is preceded by an unconscious, lightning-fast comparison of the immense amount of data you've stored in your brain over a lifetime of listening and speaking. Part 2. Counting words unconsciously. The unconscious abacus. So, how exactly does this massive mental storehouse actually work? Let's take a look. Well, it all starts with implicit learning. By definition, this is a completely non-conscious, automatic process. When you're listening to someone speak, you're focused on the meaning, right? The actual communication. You never sit there and consciously count how many times they use the word the or a specific verb tense. Yet, your brain, acting like this incredible unconscious abacus, is constantly tallying these patterns just through mere experience. Your neural networks are actively strengthening connections based purely on the frequency of what you hear. It's exactly why you instantly know when an English sentence just sounds wrong, even if you can't name the grammar rule they broke. Your brain just knows the math is off. To really wrap our heads around the sheer, staggering volume of inputs our brains process to build those connection meets, linguists look at these mega databases of language. I'm talking about things like the British National Corpus, which has over 100 million words, or the Corpus of Contemporary American English with over 450 million. Believe it or not, our brains are functioning remarkably like these massive databases. We are constantly automatically updating the statistical probability of a word or a phrase based on the massive amounts of data we process every single day of our lives. So what exactly is your brain tallying up in this internal spreadsheet? Well, quite a bit. It tracks token frequency, literally how many times a specific word like the or apple appears. It tracks type frequency, which is how many variations of an ed past tense verb exist across the whole language. It logs phonological priming, meaning how one specific sound actually triggers your brain to expect the next sound. And incredibly, it tracks multi-word chunking speed. Science shows that higher frequency words and specific chunks of words like give up or don't have to worry get activated and processed way faster because they've been tallied so many times. The words are used together so frequently, they literally fuse together in your mind. Which brings us to part 3, the limits of listening, hitting the cognitive wall. Now, if our brains are literally these incredible automatic supercomputers that tally all this data, why do second language learners inevitably hit a plateau? Why can't we just listen our way to total fluency? The answer lies in what researchers call the basic variety plateau. When adults try to learn naturalistically, just by being totally immersed in listening, they almost always fossilize at this stage. Now, the basic variety is communicatively effective. You can totally survive, you can order food, you can get your point across, but it completely lacks functional morphology. So this means you might say yesterday I go instead of went, or to cat instead of cats. It totally lacks grammatical intricacies like tense, mood, or plural markers.
All those little grammatical details are constantly present in the background input you hear, but they simply do not get picked up by your brain.
And here is the absolute kicker. Adults suffer from something called learned attention. As highlighted by research in the Journal of Education and Training Studies, frequency effects are super powerful, but they have major limits when you're relying entirely on implicit instruction. Because our adult brains are already so perfectly, finely tuned to our native language, we experience this phenomenon called blocking. Your brain actively ignores subtle, unfamiliar grammatical cues because it essentially thinks, hey, I already understood the gist of that sentence. I definitely don't need these extra details to survive. It's actively filtering out the subtle details because it is prioritizing efficiency over accuracy. Part 4, the conscious bridge, overcoming the plateau. So how on earth do we actually get past this biological roadblock to keep progressing? To build that bridge, we have to clearly contrast two very distinct systems. Implicit learning, as we've just seen, is automatic and non-conscious. It's that statistical tallying running quietly in the background. Explicit learning, on the other hand, is completely deliberate. It requires a conscious focus on form. It is active rule testing. Because the adult brain naturally filters out the low salience grammar of a new language, you absolutely cannot rely on implicit learning alone to become fluent. You have to bring conscious attention to the specific structures you're missing. Think of it this way. Explicit learning is a totally conscious operation. You are actively making and testing hypotheses, often using specific rules or even getting negative feedback from a teacher. And this is the vital tool you need to counteract your brain's natural blocking mechanisms. By forcing your brain to consciously notice new linguistic cues, like, say, deliberately focusing on the fact that Spanish adjectives change based on gender, you bypass the filter that's been holding you back. You are essentially grabbing your brain and saying, hey, pay attention, this actually matters. And this creates a brilliant, dynamic 4-step cycle that actually leads to true fluency. Step 1, conscious noticing. You realize the rule actually exists. Step 2, focused instruction. You deliberately practice it. But here's where the absolute magic happens. Once you've consciously registered that pattern, you move to step 3. Your unconscious brain can finally start tallying its frequency automatically out in the wild, which naturally leads right into step 4, fluent output. Your hard-earned explicit knowledge directly feeds and trains your automatic implicit systems. Bringing it all together, we hit our 5th and final section, a complex adaptive system, the dynamic interface. This is where all these cognitive realities merge into one comprehensive view of how we actually learn. Because the research makes it absolutely crystal clear. Language isn't just a dry list of vocabulary words to memorize, and it's definitely not just abstract grammar rules. It is a complex adaptive system. It emerges entirely from the dynamic, interconnected interactions of implicit and explicit learning. Real language fluency relies on this beautiful, complex dance between your conscious and your unconscious mind. So why does this matter for your own study habits? Because you need the conscious focus to notice the fine details initially, but you also need the massive unconscious tallying of input to make producing those details fast and automatic. You simply can't have one without the other. So as we wrap up this explainer today, I want to leave you with a pretty provocative question for your own language journey. Are you just listening to the noise, or are you actually paying attention to the signals? Look, passive listening is only going to get you so far before your brain just blocks out the rest. To truly master a new language, you have to consciously tune into those signals, force your brain to notice the rules, and then let your unconscious abacus do the rest of the heavy lifting. Thanks so much for joining me today, and keep learning deliberately.